Thanks, Adam. I too would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land we're gathered on, the Bedigal people of the Eora Nation. As we celebrate Reading Australia, it seems highly appropriate to me to think of these people, the first storytellers of Australia. It's such a great pleasure to be here today celebrating Reading Australia, which I've been nurturing and losing sleep over since it was just a twinkle in the great Brian John's eye on a cold and very sunny winter's day in Canberra in 2009. We were there being hosted by the National Library, and they were showing off their brand new resource trove, which most of us know. It's an incredible online archive. Anyway, that's where we were. Headland issues were always at the front of Brian's mind. And one of those, then, was the dearth of Australian books a student could expect to encounter at school or university. Brian was furious to read about this, saying, "We fought those bloody wars in the 1960s and we're not going to go back there." The recognition of a need he coupled with the obvious potential of Trove, but needed curation to truly realise its power, was the beginning of Reading Australia. His first idea to partner with the National Library to put on their very rich multimedia archival material together with a list of seminal Australian works. And the reason he thought of this was that they were showing off Trove, and I mean, it is something to be incredibly proud of as a nation, and I hope we fund it properly. But we said, let's take it to a test drive, keyed into their search engine Patrick White, thinking, well, he's a Nobel Prize-winning Australian writer. There'd obviously be a lot there. 10,000 search results, 4 of the top 10 were about agricultural pumps from the United States. And Brian said, problem, leant back, had this idea, said, we'll bring these two things together and I'll try to solve this problem about teachers saying there aren't enough resources. So, first task, a list. He said, let's come up with 250 titles, doesn't really matter, it's just a beginning. And I remember scratching around saying, who do we ask? Every publisher in the country will have their own list at their heart. Every other set seemed a little bit biased one way or another, or not quite the expert set. And finally, Angelo, who's here, dreamt up with me a very good use for the ASA Council. 12 of Australia's most esteemed and senior writers. And we set them a task to come to think about the idea before they came in. We said 250 titles, and we're not giving you any direction other than you have to think that they're significant works and that they tell Australia's story, cover the key themes in our history and our present and probably into the future. That was a wonderful 2 days, a heated discussion. I wish we'd kept notes. Second, we had the list. What did we do with it? And I went back to Brian and I said, I know the original idea was the partnership with the National Library, but why don't we talk to teachers about what they want? That's the need we're trying to fill. And so we began consultation with the education sector. And that was led by a board director who's not here today, Jeremy Fisher, up at the University of New England, thinking being, they've got the NBN, this is going to be an entirely online service, what a wonderful place to start building this from. At that meeting, they did one very, very important thing for us, which was come up with a name. Before that, I said, what about the Australian Digital Library or Australian English Teaching Online? And everybody said, very boring, no. Reading Australia was perfect. It's expansive and capable of encapsulating so many things. The other thing they said to us was, we've got an incoming national curriculum. Let's look at that. English teachers have not typically had resources for books prepared for them. Why don't we do that? Because we know the reason teachers aren't more adventurous with choosing different texts is they're bloody busy and they tend to teach the same works because they've collected the resources they need. So we thought, great idea. So the partnerships with AATE, with ETA, the English Teacher Associations across the country, ALIA, Peter, came about. And that brings me to Stephen Wilson, who I met early on, and I told him this was what we wanted to do, And he said, you need to look at what we've already built for ACARA, the federal body that was going about implementing the national curriculum. He said, we've built a website called English for the Australian Curriculum. You should look at that as a framework. And that did indeed form the basis for Reading Australia, except we were solely about Australian books on the Reading Australia list. And Lyndon Hyatt, who's not here, was a genius who was the IT mind behind that, who came in and consulted with us and gave us expert advice as we went about it. We started with a pilot of 10 resources for primary, 10 for secondary, that educational group in Armidale, to just test this idea and create essays around the secondary texts. They'll be great for teachers to dip into to see if these are books they want to teach. They'll be non-academic, they'll be personal responses from writers. And it turns out they're one of our most successful elements on the site, and they bring general readers in who read really moving accounts of how people have responded to the different texts. The next thing we had to do after the pilot, we had a little bit of money for the start, was to persuade the Cultural Fund that this was indeed something worth putting a lot of cultural funding into. And Brian, as with so many of his big ideas, they were huge. It was challenging at the time. And then the rest of us caught up and we realised it was perfect, as with so many of Brian's ideas. As Brian would always say about many other things, Zoe, things work because of the force of a good idea. And that's true. We have since then been consulting with all those groups. We also had to talk to our publishers, because another reason other than no teaching resources that teachers gave us for not teaching more books that were Australian was they're out of print. Very luckily for us, a lot of our publishers were very busy digitising works because the cost of digitisation had come down. As soon as we told them what we were planning, and when they heard Brian was part of it, they said, right, we've got these things, we will prioritise Reading Australia books right up the top of those digitisation plans. So we'd solved that part of the problem. So they were the beginning of great partnerships, and as Brian said, it embedded us in our community, rather than just being, as he would have said, a rather unsexy tax collector for authors and publishers. We partnered deeply with the education sector, providing a service and listening to them about what they needed. So for me, I think it's just a great thing to be doing, to have done, celebrating our best stories and helping our teachers to share these with their students. We also always hoped it would benefit our members, and I'm told that authors see their royalties for works that might have dropped off in the sales, maybe fallen out of print, that they see royalties building, and the only thing they can think they could attribute that to would be Reading Australia, and that's a great pleasure. And for me, it's a great gift. Typically, the Cultural Fund gives money to third parties to go away and realise their dreams. This initiative is the first and the only one we've run in-house, building and adapting what it will be with our members and partners. And somehow I became an accidental publisher along the way. Anyway, that's all I have to say, because I know Libby's going to have much more. Thank you very much. And I've got to say, hallelujah, Brian Johns.